My former daughter-in-law left her only son with me for what she promised was a single weekend, then vanished into the ether for 9 long years. When she discovered the $1,200,000 legacy my late son had secured for his boy, she didn't come back with flowers or apologies. She came with the state police and a warrant accusing me of kidnapping. But as the gavel echoed in the courtroom, I handed a heavy, wax-sealed envelope to the bench. The judge broke the seal, scanned the contents, and turned pale. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Looking at me with visible shock, he whispered, "Does she have any idea this exists?" I met his gaze and replied calmly, "Not yet, Your Honor." The chime of the doorbell rang out at exactly 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. In my 72 years, I have learned that 7:30 is a time for coffee and reflection, not for visitors. Unless someone is selling salvation or delivering tragedy, they don't knock before 8. I smoothed my robe, expecting a misguided courier. Instead, I opened the door to find 2 grim-faced officers and a ghost from a life I thought I had buried. "Mr. Sterling?" the lead officer asked. His name tag read Miller, and he had the stiff, practiced posture of a man expecting a physical altercation. "We are here regarding a report of child endangerment and illegal detention. We need to speak with your grandson, Leo." Behind him stood Evelyn, my son's widow, the woman who had evaporated 9 years ago like mist over the Sound. She was draped in a coat that looked far more expensive than any she had owned when she lived under my roof. Tears were already carving tracks through her foundation, heavy, dramatic streaks that reminded me of a poorly staged theater production. Having spent 45 years as a senior auditor for the federal government, I was trained to distinguish between a genuine deficit and a creative accounting trick. Evelyn's grief was the ultimate creative entry. It was a fraudulent ledger in human form. "My poor baby," Evelyn wailed, her voice hitting a shrill note that made the officers flinch. She reached toward the door frame, as if she were auditioning for a Victorian tragedy. "Where's my son? What have you done to him?" I heard the soft thud of footsteps on the hardwood behind me. Leo, now 14 years old and nearly as tall as I am, appeared in the hallway, his chemistry textbook tucked under his arm. He stopped dead, staring at the crying woman at the door with a look of pure, clinical confusion. "Grandpa," his voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying ripple of uncertainty. "Who is that lady?" Evelyn's performance shifted into overdrive. "Leo. Oh, my sweet, sweet Leo. It's Mommy. I've finally found you. I've been searching every corner of the country." I watched my grandson's face. There was no spark of recognition, no rush of warmth. Why would there be? Leo was 5 when she walked out the door to buy a pack of gum and never came back. To him, the woman on my porch was a stranger using a title she hadn't earned. "Mr. Sterling," Officer Miller continued, his hand resting near his belt, "a formal complaint has been filed. We need to clear this up immediately." The mother claims she was forcibly separated from the child. I felt a familiar chill settle into my marrow. It wasn't fear. I am an auditor. I don't fear the audit, I welcome it. I had been preparing for this specific Tuesday for over 3,000 days. I had anticipated her greed the moment my son's life insurance and the subsequent investments cleared the $1 million mark. "Of course, officer," I said, my voice as level as a balance sheet. "Please step inside. I believe you'll find this investigation quite enlightening." I stepped back, ushering them into the living room, the room where Leo had learned his periodic table, where we'd spent hundreds of hours building intricate ship models, and where I had held him while he sobbed because his mother's phone number was no longer in service. Evelyn marched in with a predatory grace, her eyes scanning the room, landing on the mahogany furniture and the original artwork on the walls. She wasn't looking for her son's baby pictures. She was calculating the equity in the house. "I've spent every penny I have looking for him," Evelyn told the officers, her voice breaking with practiced precision. "He took him from me while I was at my lowest. I went away for a weekend of grief counseling after my husband passed, and when I returned, the house was empty. He'd stolen my life." I didn't laugh, though the sheer audacity of the lie was almost impressive. "If you're going to embezzle the truth, You might as well go for the highest possible figure. I settled into my wingback chair, the leather creaking under me like a familiar friend. I didn't look at Evelyn. I looked at Officer Miller. I saw the way his eyes tracked the room, noticing the framed honors Leo had won in school and the lack of any missing person tension in the house. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a home. Is that so, Evelyn? I asked softly. A weekend of grief counseling? That is a very specific narrative. It is a pity the facts are so uncooperative with your memory. I turned back to the officers. Gentlemen, I understand the gravity of a kidnapping accusation. As a former senior auditor for the Department of the Treasury, I find that people often lie, but paper never does. I have a comprehensive file in my study containing legal guardianship papers, state-certified custody orders, and a decade of residency records. Would you like to review them here? Or should we move to my office? Officer Miller's eyebrows rose. He had been briefed on a distraught mother and a rogue grandfather hiding a child in a basement. He hadn't expected a man who spoke in terms of certified records and residency logs. Those papers are forged. Evelyn shrieked, her face turning a blotchy, panicked red. He used his government connections to fake the stamps. Officers, don't listen to him. He's a manipulator. He's been brainwashing my son for a decade. Officer Miller held up a hand, his palm flat. Ma'am, please. Let the man provide his documentation. Miller, go with him. He gestured to the younger officer, a man named Henderson, who followed me down the hallway. As we walked, I heard Evelyn's voice drifting from the living room, shifting back into her nurturing mother persona. Leo, honey, come on, mommy. I have so much to tell you. I bought you so many presents back in Oregon. I heard Leo's response, and it filled me with a quiet, fierce pride. Please stay where the officer told you to stay, ma'am. I don't know who you are, and you're making my grandfather's house feel very crowded. In the study, I opened the heavy oak cabinet. Inside were 3 identical binders, color-coded and tabbed. I pulled out the primary blue binder. It contained every shred of evidence regarding Leo's life since the day she walked out. Here, I said, handing the binder to Officer Henderson. Tab 1, the original temporary custody order from 9 years ago. Tab 2, the private investigator's report detailing Mrs. Sterling's, now Mrs. Vance's, whereabouts during her searching phase. Tab 3, certified copies of every school enrollment and medical record for the last 9 years, all listing me as the sole legal guardian. Henderson flipped through the pages, his professional detachment wavering. This is incredibly thorough, Mr. Sterling. You even have logs of missed child support payments. I don't leave things to chance, officer. An audit is won or lost in the details. If you look at page 14, you'll see a printout from a social media account under the name Evelyn Vance. It's dated 6 months after she disappeared. She's on a beach in Cabo San Lucas. The caption says, finally free of the past. New life, no baggage. I'll let the word baggage hang in the air. We both knew she meant the 5-year-old boy currently standing in my living room. We returned to the main room. Officer Miller took the binder from his partner and began to scan it. The more he read, the further his mouth set into a hard line. Evelyn was watching him, her fingers twitching at her sides. She could see the tide turning. This is all a lie, she shouted, her voice cracking. He's a rich man. He paid people to write these things. I was sick. I had a breakdown after my husband died in that car crash. I wasn't in my right mind. You were in your right mind enough to marry a man named Marcus Vance in Portland exactly 4 months after you left Leo on my doorstep, I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria. You were in your right mind enough to buy a house in his name to hide your assets. And you were certainly in your right mind when you blocked my phone number on January 12th, 2016. Evelyn's jaw dropped. She hadn't realized I knew about Marcus. She hadn't realized I knew about the house in Portland. What brought you back, Evelyn? I asked, stepping closer. Was it a sudden burst of maternal love? Or was it the news that my son's tech patents finally cleared probate? Was it the realization that Leo is now the sole beneficiary of a trust worth $1,200,000? The silence that followed was deafening. The officers looked at Evelyn. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. The greed was written in the way her eyes widened at the mention of the specific dollar amount. "I have rights," she hissed, the mask of the grieving mother finally slipping off to reveal the cold, calculating woman beneath. "I'm the biological mother. No piece of paper can change that. I'll take you to every court in this state. I'll ruin you, Robert. I'll take that money, and I'll take the boy just to spite you." Officer Miller closed the binder with a heavy thud. "Ma'am, based on these certified court documents, Mr. Sterling has full legal guardianship. There is no evidence of kidnapping here. If you want to contest this, you'll have to do it through family court. But right now, you need to leave this property. This isn't over." Evelyn spat, grabbing her designer bag. She looked at Leo, who was standing by the window, his expression unreadable. "You'll see, Leo. You'll be coming with me soon enough, and you'll bring your grandfather's checkbook with you." She stormed out, Marcus, who had been lurking by the car, scurrying to open her door. As the sound of their engine faded, the house felt suddenly, blissfully quiet. Leo looked at me, his shoulders finally dropping from their defensive hunch. "Is she really my mom, Grandpa?" I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "She gave birth to you, Leo, but she hasn't been your mother for a very long time. And I promise you, on my life, she is never going to take you anywhere." But as I looked out the window, I knew this was just the opening move. Evelyn was a gambler, and she thought she had a winning hand because of her biological rights. She didn't realize that in my safe, I held the one document that rendered her hand worthless. I had been waiting 9 years to play that card. I just needed the right table. After the police cruisers finally pulled away from the curb, leaving the air smelling of exhaust and unresolved tension, the house felt strangely haunted by the lingering echo of Evelyn's voice. It was as if her presence had left a film of oil over the furniture, a residue of drama that didn't belong in our quiet, structured lives. I stood in the foyer for a long moment, listening to the silence of the walls. I could hear Leo's shallow breathing from the kitchen, a rhythm I had memorized over nearly a decade of watchful nights. I moved slowly to the stove and began the familiar task of making him a cup of cocoa. This was a ritual from his early childhood, a reliable defense against the monsters of the world that he still accepted when the earth felt tilted on its axis. I whisked the chocolate with a silver spoon, counting the rotations. 1, 2, 3. A habit of a man who found comfort in precise measurements. When the steam rose in a perfect column, I brought the mug to him. He was sitting at the table, his hands curled into fists, looking at the spot where the officers had stood. He took the mug, nodding a silent thank you, and retreated to his room to study. I knew he wouldn't actually be reading his chemistry notes. His mind was likely miles away, trying to reconcile the image of the weeping woman at the door with the grandfather who had been his entire world. I retreated to my study, the room that served as the command center for my life. It was a space defined by mahogany shelves and the faint, dry scent of old paper, the smell of an auditor's sanctuary. I sat in my high-back chair and pulled out a separate, weathered folder from the bottom drawer of my desk. This wasn't the polished binder I had shown the police. This was the ledger of my heart, the raw, unedited record of the night. Everything changed. I opened the cover, and my mind drifted back to December 21st, 2015. The Pacific Northwest winter was at its most brutal that year. Rain had turned into a cruel, jagged sleet that hammered against the windows like handfuls of gravel. The wind was howling off the sound, shaking the very foundations of the house. There was a frantic, uneven knocking at the door around 11 o'clock at night. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of a neighbor. It was the desperate, staccato pounding of someone who had nowhere else to run. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in like a physical blow. Evelyn was there, shivering, her hair plastered to her forehead by the freezing rain. She was holding a 5-year-old Leo, who was wrapped in a mismatched pile of blankets that looked like they had been grabbed in a hurry. "Arthur, please," she had sobbed, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Her eyes were rimmed with a deep, bruised red, and as she brushed past me into the warmth of the hall, she smelled faintly of expensive gin and cheap desperation. "My sister in Portland. She's been in a horrific accident. A multi-car pileup on the interstate. She's in the ICU, Arthur." They don't know if she'll make the night. She gripped my arm with fingers that felt like ice. I have to go. I have to be there. But I can't take Leo into that environment. I can't let him see his aunt like that. It's just for 48 hours. 72 at the most. Please, you're the only family I have left. My son, Thomas, had been gone for 2 years by then, taken from us in a car accident that still felt like a fresh wound. Seeing Leo standing there, blinking sleepily from beneath those blankets, was like seeing a flickering candle in a dark, empty room. He had Thomas's nose and that same stubborn set of the jaw. I didn't hesitate. I reached out and took the sleeping boy from her arms, feeling the surprising weight of him. Of course, Evelyn. Go. Be with your sister. Don't worry about a thing here. Leo and I'll be fine. We'll be right here waiting. She didn't even kiss him goodbye. She didn't linger to see him settle onto the sofa. She just turned and ran back out into the sleet, toward a car idling at the curb with its headlights cutting through the dark, a car I later realized belonged to Marcus Vance. She didn't look back. Not once. That was the last time Leo felt the touch of his mother for 3,285 days. The 48 hours came and went like a fever dream. I kept the cocoa hot and the cartoons running, waiting for the phone to ring. But the 72 hours passed into a week, and the week bled into a month of deafening silence. I called her cell phone every hour for the first 3 days, my heart rate spiking with every ring, until the "this number is no longer in service" recording became the grim soundtrack to my growing panic. I eventually tracked down her sister's number in Portland. When she answered, her voice was clear and vibrant. She wasn't in the ICU. She hadn't been in an accident. In fact, she hadn't seen Evelyn in 3 years and didn't even know her sister had claimed to have a breakdown. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a liquidation. By February, the questions began to change. Leo had stopped asking when Mommy was coming home. This soon, Leo and any day now lies I'd been feeding him had lost their flavor. By March, the trauma began to manifest in ways that broke my heart. Leo started wetting the bed again, a regression that felt like a silent scream. He would wake up in the middle of the night, shrieking for a woman who was currently posting photos of her new beginning on social media. It was then, sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, that I realized I wasn't just a grandfather babysitting for a long weekend. I was a guardian of a child who had been discarded like an old coat that no longer fit. As an auditor, I knew that if you don't account for an asset, you lose it to the void. I knew that I couldn't just hope she wouldn't come back. I had to build a wall. I went to see a woman named Diane Vance, a woman who had no relation to the man Evelyn had run off with, despite the coincidence of the name. Diane was one of the sharpest family law attorneys in the state, a woman who understood that the law was not about feelings, but about the strength of the record. I want her gone legally, I told Diane during our first meeting in the spring of 2016. I sat in her office, my hands folded over my briefcase. I don't just want custody. I want a fortress. I want a wall around this boy that no amount of biological claiming can ever breach. I want to make sure she can never reach over and disrupt his life again. Diane had looked at me over her spectacles with a weary, professional kindness. Arthur, you have to understand how the system works. The law is a pendulum. Right now, it swings toward you because she's absent and the boy is safe. But if she returns a year from now, or 5 years from now, judges love the reformed mother narrative. They want to believe in second chances. They'll give her visitation. They might even give her back her son if she plays the victim well enough and claims she was in a fugue state of grief. Then we need to make sure she can't play. I replied, my voice as cold as the sleet that had delivered Leo to me. What is the most absolute, most irreversible thing a parent can do in this state? What is the point of no return? Voluntary termination of parental rights, Diane said, leaning back in her chair. But Arthur, no parent in their right mind signs that unless they are facing 20 years in prison or are truly monstrous. It's legal suicide. You're asking for her to sign a document that says she no longer exists as his mother. Evelyn isn't monstrous in the way you think, I said. She's just transactional. She's a woman who views people as line items on a balance sheet. Everything has a price. We just need to find hers. We need to figure out what she wants more than her son. I spent the next 4 months tracking her like a high-stakes embezzlement case. My private investigator, a man who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found, located her in a luxury condo in Portland. She was living a life of high-end shopping, late-night gallery openings, and expensive parties. She was being fueled by the small inheritance my son Thomas had left her, money that was intended to be a safety net for Leo's college education. She was burning through it at a rate of $10,000 a month, buying a lifestyle she couldn't afford. I watched the reports come in. I watched the photos of her laughing with Marcus Vance while Leo was at home, crying over a scraped knee. I waited until she was nearly broke. I waited until the investigator told me she was 3 months behind on her condo payments and that her credit cards were being declined at the local boutiques. Then, and only then, I sent Diane. We didn't go in with threats of police or kidnapping charges. We knew that would only make her defensive and trigger a legal battle I didn't want Leo to witness. Instead, we went in with an exit ramp. We offered her what we called a fresh start agreement. If she signed a voluntary termination of parental rights, I would waive any and all future child support claims, a debt that would have climbed into the hundreds of thousands over the next 13 years. I also offered to provide a one-time relocation stipend of $25,000. It was hush money, plain and simple. It was the price of her silence and her absence. I was buying my grandson's freedom. I remember the day Diane called me from the notary's office in Portland. I was standing in my kitchen, watching Leo play in the backyard with a plastic dinosaur. "She's here, Arthur," Diane whispered. "She's looking at the papers. She's wearing a $1,000 suit, and she smells like a distillery. Is she asking about him?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it might crack a bone. Did she ask how he's doing in school? Did she ask if he still likes the dinosaurs? No, Diane's voice was like ice. She didn't ask a single question about the boy. She's asking if the $25,000 is tax-free. And she's currently arguing with the notary about whether she can still keep the diamond tennis bracelet Thomas bought her for their 5th anniversary. She wants to make sure there are no clawback provisions for the jewelry. "Tell her yes to everything," I said, closing my eyes and leaning against the counter. "Give her the jewelry. Give her the money. Just get the signature on every single page." 30 minutes later, the fax machine in my study began to hum and click. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times in my career, but this time it was the sound of a life being secured. Page after page of dense legal text slid out onto the tray. I waited for the final page, the one that carried the weight of the entire audit. There it was, Evelyn Marie Sterling. Her signature was bold, confident, and utterly devoid of hesitation. Attached was a separate affidavit, written in her own hand as required by the state-appointed psychologist we had paid to witness the signing. In that affidavit, she had written words that I would never forget. "I am not suited for motherhood. I never felt the bond they talk about. I wish to pursue my own life and my career without the burden of a child. I believe Arthur Sterling can provide a better environment, and I freely relinquish all claims, now and forever, in exchange for my independence and the settlement offered." I had taken that paper, placed it in a light-proof, acid-free envelope, and walked it directly to a high-security bank vault. I only kept a high-resolution copy in my home safe. To the world and to the school boards, I just had full legal guardianship. I never filed the termination papers with the general custody file at the local courthouse. I kept them in reserve. I was an auditor, and I knew the value of a hidden reserve. I wanted Evelyn to feel safe in her new life. I wanted her to forget she'd ever had a son, so she wouldn't come back and try to extort more money from me while Leo was young and impressionable. I wanted her to think the books were closed. For 9 years, I played the longest game of my life. I watched Leo grow from a heartbroken child into a brilliant young man. I watched the trust fund I'd established for him, started with the $500,000 from Thomas's life insurance, grow to over $1 million, $200,000 through aggressive, meticulous market investments, and every spare cent from my own pension. I knew that one day, the news of that money would leak. I knew that Evelyn, whose life was a series of bad bets and expensive mistakes, would eventually hear the tally. I knew that Marcus Vance was a known gambler with a trail of debt across 3 states. They would come looking for a payday. They would see Leo as a human ATM. And now, here they were, standing on my porch with the police, thinking they were the ones conducting the audit. I looked at the copy of the affidavit on my desk. The ink was 9 years old, but the words were as sharp as a razor. Evelyn thought she was coming for $1 million inheritance. She didn't realize she was walking into an audit of her own soul. She thought she could use her biology as a master key, but I had changed the locks years ago. The doorbell rang again, breaking my reverie. It was a sharp, aggressive sound. I turned to my security monitor and saw a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit carrying a legal briefcase. He was pacing on the porch, looking at his watch. It was Harold Finch, Evelyn's attorney. He was the kind of lawyer who specialized in emergency petitions, the kind of man who thrived on the chaos of broken families. I stood up and walked to the mirror in the hall. I adjusted my tie with the same precision I used to check a tax return. My reflection showed an old man. Yes, but an old man who had spent 45 years finding the hidden discrepancies in the books of the powerful. Evelyn Vance was a massive, glaring discrepancy, a fraudulent entry in the ledger of Leo's life, and I was about to close her account for good. I walked to the door and pulled it open, my expression as neutral as a blank sheet of paper. "Mr. Sterling?" the lawyer asked, trying to puff out his chest to look intimidating. "I'm Harold Finch. I represent Evelyn Vance. We've just filed an emergency petition in the 3rd District Family Court to vacate your guardianship and freeze all assets related to the Thomas Sterling estate, pending a full audit of your stewardship. You've been served." He thrust a stack of papers toward me, his eyes searching for a flicker of fear. I took the papers with a polite, almost bored nod. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. I appreciate the prompt delivery. I'll see you and your client in court on Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Please tell Mrs. Vance to wear something modest. Judges in this county aren't particularly fond of theater, but they adore the truth." He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision, and turned away to walk back to his car. I watched him go, then I closed the door and felt a strange, profound sense of calm. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly where I had predicted they would go 9 years ago. I walked back into the living room, where Leo had emerged from his room. He was looking at the legal papers in my hand with a look of quiet intensity. "Are we really going to court, Grandpa?" he asked. "Is she really going to try to take me away?" I walked over and stood in front of him, putting my hands on his shoulders. "We're going to court, Leo, but I want you to listen to me very carefully. An auditor's job is to make sure that the truth is the only thing left on the page at the end of the day. And I have spent 9 years making sure our truth is undeniable. By Friday afternoon, that woman will never be able to even speak your name again. Do you trust me?" Leo looked at me, and for the first time that day, the tension left his face. "I trust you, Grandpa. I always have." I went back to my study and began the final preparations. I checked the dates, verified the signatures, and made sure every tab in my binder was perfectly aligned. I was ready for the final audit. I was ready to show Evelyn Vance that in the ledger of life, you cannot reclaim what you have already sold. The interest on her choices had finally come due, and I was the one who was going to collect. The Friday morning air was crisp and biting as we walked toward the county courthouse, the kind of cold that settles deep into your joints and reminds you of the passage of time. Leo walked beside me, his pace steady and his chin tucked into the heavy wool scarf I'd bought him for his last birthday. He didn't look like a victim of a custody battle. He looked like a young man heading into a high-stakes business meeting. I had spent years teaching him that the best way to handle an adversary was with posture and silence. I told him often that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the weakest ledger. "Let them talk until they run out of air, Leo," I had whispered in the car. "Let them dig the hole with their own words, and when they're finished, we will simply present the receipts." He had nodded, his expression mirroring my own, composed, analytical, and prepared. The courtroom was a cavernous space paneled in dark, aged wood that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It felt like a cathedral built for the worship of facts. Judge Silas Thorne sat high on the bench, a man known throughout the state for his sharp tongue and his absolute intolerance for procedural messiness or emotional manipulation. He was a facts and figures judge, a man who saw the world in columns of black and white, which suited my professional temperament perfectly. To an auditor, there is no room for maybe in a final tally. Evelyn was already seated at the petitioner's table when we entered. She had undergone a remarkable transformation since her dramatic appearance on my doorstep. She had traded her flashy designer coat and oversized sunglasses for a simple, navy blue dress that looked like it had been chosen specifically to mimic the attire of a Sunday school teacher. She clutched a small lace handkerchief in her trembling hands, dabbing at eyes that looked suspiciously dry despite her rhythmic sniffing. Beside her, Marcus sat in the front row of the gallery, his cheap suit straining at the shoulders. He was leaning forward, his eyes darting around the room like a man watching a racehorse he'd bet his last dollar on, hoping against hope for a windfall he hadn't earned. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, his voice echoing against the high ceiling. Judge Thorne shuffled through the thick stack of papers in front of him, his eyes scanning the filings with clinical speed. "We are here for case number 74209, Vance versus Sterling. We have an emergency petition to vacate guardianship and a secondary claim of child abduction and financial mismanagement. Mr. Finch, you represent the petitioner. You have the floor." Evelyn's lawyer stood up, smoothing his tie and puffing out his chest with an air of practiced indignation. "Your Honor, what we have here is a tragedy of the highest order, a failure of the system to protect the most sacred bond in nature. My client, a grieving mother, was separated from her only child during a period of intense, crushing psychological trauma following the untimely death of her husband. She didn't abandon her son, despite what the respondent claims. She was coerced, intimidated, and manipulated by Mr. Arthur Sterling. He used his substantial wealth and his decades of experience in government auditing to bulldoze a vulnerable woman. He has held this boy in a state of virtual isolation for 9 years, poisoning his mind against his own mother while systematically siphoning funds from the boy's rightful inheritance for his own purposes. I felt a small, sharp twitch in my jaw at the mention of siphoning, but I didn't move an inch. I remained a statue of professional indifference. Beside me, Diane Vance, my attorney, who possessed a mind like a steel trap, didn't even look up from her notes. She simply scribbled a single word on her yellow notepad in large, looping letters, theatrical. My client has spent nearly a decade and every cent of her meager resources searching for her son, Finch continued, his voice rising in a rehearsed crescendo that was clearly intended for a more gullible audience than Judge Thorne. Now that she has finally located him, Mr. Sterling is using his legal fortress to keep a mother from her child. We ask the court for the immediate restoration of parental rights, an immediate change in physical custody, and an injunction against the trust fund currently managed by the respondent to prevent further depletion of the boy's future. Judge Thorne didn't look impressed. He looked over the top of his spectacles at Evelyn, his gaze heavy. "Mrs. Vance, the court is mindful of the emotional weight of these proceedings. Would you like to speak to the record?" Evelyn stood up slowly, her lip trembling with the precision of a seasoned actress. It was a masterpiece of a performance. "Your Honor," she began, her voice a fragile whisper. "I saw my baby back. I was so young when Thomas died, so broken by the loss. Arthur told me I was a bad mother. He told me I would lose Leo to the state and that he would end up in a foster home if I didn't let him take him. I was scared, alone, and I ran because I didn't think I had a choice. But I never stopped looking for him. I sent letters that were returned to sender. I made hundreds of calls that were blocked or ignored. He stole 9 years of my life, Your Honor. 9 years I can never get back. Please, I am begging you, don't let him steal the rest of our lives." She sat down, letting out a soft, choked sob that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. In the gallery, Marcus nodded solemnly, playing his part in the charade. Judge Thorne turned his piercing gaze toward our table. "Mr. Sterling, your attorney may speak to the legalities, but given the extreme gravity of the child abduction allegation, the court would like to hear from you directly as well. You have been the primary custodian for nearly a decade. What is your response to these claims of coercion and search? I stood up slowly, the movement deliberate and unhurried. I adjusted the sleeves of my suit, ensuring everything was perfectly aligned. Your Honor, as an auditor for the federal government for 45 years, I've spent my life dealing in the only currency that truly matters, the truth. In a ledger, if a number is missing, we don't call it trauma, we call it deficit. If a payment is not made, it isn't an accident, it is a default. Mrs. Vance has presented a narrative of desperate search and maternal longing. Yet my professional life has taught me that records tell a far more accurate story than memories do. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out the primary blue binder, the one I had used to satisfy the police, though today it served a much higher purpose. I have here a certified chronological log of the last 9 years. Tab 1 contains the telephone records for every landline and cellular device I have owned since December of 2015. There is not a single incoming call, not one, from any area code associated with the petitioner. Tab 2 contains a comprehensive report from a licensed private investigator. It shows that while Mrs. Vance was supposedly searching for her son with every resource, she was actually residing in a luxury condominium in Portland, vacationing in Cabo San Lucas and Puerto Vallarta on 3 separate occasions, and purchasing a 2024 luxury SUV in cash just 6 months ago. Evelyn's lawyer jumped up, his face reddening. Objection. My client's private financial life is completely irrelevant to her fundamental biological rights as a mother. Overruled, Thorne said sharply, his eyes never leaving my binder. Mr. Finch, if your client is claiming under oath that she spent every resource searching for a missing child, her actual spending habits and lifestyle are very relevant to her credibility as a witness. Continue, Mr. Sterling. I bow my head slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. Most importantly, I must address the matter of the inheritance and the accusation of siphoning. Mrs. Vance claims I'm depleting the boy's future. Tab 5 contains a full, independent audit of the Leo Sterling Trust. The principal amount of $500,000, which originated from my son's life insurance, has grown to $1,200,000. This growth occurred because I have not taken a single penny, not for his tuition, not for his medical insurance, not for his clothing, and not for his food. I have funded his entire existence out of my own retirement savings and pension. The trust remains untouched, accruing interest for his 25th birthday. The judge's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. You've paid for everything yourself? For 9 years? Private school, healthcare, the whole of it? I have, Your Honor, because Leo is my grandson, not a line item to be balanced. I didn't want him to ever feel like he owed his survival to a fund that his mother might one day try to pick apart. I wanted his future to be unencumbered by the debts of the past. Evelyn's face was no longer blotchy with feigned emotion. It was pale, drained of its color. She whispered something frantic to her lawyer, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized his client's meager resources story was being dismantled by a man who kept a record of every cent. Your Honor, Finch stammered, trying to regain his footing. While Mr. Sterling's financial stewardship is undeniably admirable, it does not and cannot supersede the fundamental, constitutionally protected right of a biological mother to her child. The law in this state favors reunification wherever possible. Mrs. Vance is ready to be a mother now. She has a stable home, a husband, and a sincere desire to make amends for the time lost. Judge Thorne sighed, a long, weary sound as he rubbed his temples. The law does favor reunification, Mr. Finch. Judge Thorne sighed, a long, weary sound as he rubbed his temples. The law does favor reunification, Mr. Finch. That is the baseline. But the law also favors stability and the best interests of a child who has lived a decade in one home. A 9-year absence is a massive hurdle to clear. However, the court is in a difficult position. Unless there is a formal, legal termination of parental rights on file, the biological connection remains. I am inclined to grant a period of supervised visitation as a starting point for a possible custody transition, provided the background checks return clear. I saw Evelyn's eyes light up with a sharp flash of triumph. She looked back at Marcus in the gallery and offered a small, fleeting wink. It was a gesture of pure greed, hidden from the judge, but visible to me. She thought she had won. She thought the mommy card was the trump card that could beat any auditor's ledger. I looked at Diane. She gave me a slow, resolute nod. It was time to close the books. Your Honor, I said, my voice resonating with a new depth in the quiet room. Before you rule on the matter of visitation, custody, or the freezing of assets, there is one final document that has not been entered into the public record. In my 45 years of auditing, I learned one very important lesson. Always keep the most important receipt in a separate, fireproof safe. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out the heavy, wax-sealed envelope I had retrieved from the bank vault. The red wax was still intact, stamped with the seal of the notary. I walked to the bailiff and handed it over with a steady hand. This, Your Honor, is a certified, notarized, and psychologically witnessed voluntary termination of parental rights. It was signed by Evelyn Marie Sterling in June of 2016. It includes a 3-page, handwritten affidavit explaining exactly why she chose to walk away and why she felt she was unsuited for the burden of motherhood. The courtroom went absolutely silent. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the back wall. Evelyn didn't just go pale. She looked as though the floor had vanished beneath her. Her lawyer reached for the envelope, his hand shaking, but the judge pulled it toward himself with a look of intense focus. This was never filed with the court clerk? Thorne asked, his voice low as he looked at me. No, Your Honor. I kept it in a private trust held by my attorney. I didn't want to humiliate the petitioner or cause Leo the unnecessary pain of knowing the full depth of her rejection while he was still a child. I had hoped she would stay away and find peace in her new, unencumbered life. I only ever intended to produce this document if she attempted to use Leo as a financial instrument, as she has done today. Judge Thorne broke the wax seal with a sharp, echoing crack. He pulled out the papers and began to read. He read slowly, his eyes moving back and forth across Evelyn's own handwriting. The confession of a woman who had traded her son for $25,000 and a diamond bracelet. As he read, the grieving mother at the table began to physically crumble. She didn't sob this time. She just sat there, frozen in time, as the reality of her own signature came back to haunt her. She had been so eager for that check 9 years ago that she had signed away her soul, and she'd never expected the old auditor to keep the receipt. The judge finally looked up, and for the first time, his expression was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at Evelyn, then at the paper, then back at Evelyn. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. Does she know? He whispered, almost to himself. I stood tall, my shoulders square. Not yet, Your Honor. I believe she's been operating under the assumption that I was far too soft-hearted to keep a meticulous record of her greed. Judge Thorne turned his gaze to Evelyn, his voice like rolling thunder. Mrs. Vance, did you or did you not sign a legal document in June of 2016 stating, and I quote, I am not suited for motherhood and wish to pursue my own life and career without the burden of a child? Evelyn's lawyer grabbed the paper from the bench, his eyes widening as he saw the notary's seal and the signature of the state-appointed psychologist. He slumped back in his chair, his face a mask of defeat. He realized in that moment that he had been representing a woman who had already sold the rights to the very story she was trying to tell. I was under duress, Evelyn whispered, her voice barely a croak. He forced me. You were under the duress of a $25,000 relocation check, I said, my voice cutting through her lie like a scalpel. A check which you cashed at a branch in Portland exactly 4 hours after signing this document, according to the bank records found in tab 7 of my binder. Judge Thorne slammed his gavel down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. Enough. We will take a 15-minute recess while I review the validity of this document in chambers. Mr. Finch, I suggest you have a very serious, very private conversation with your client about the severe penalties for perjury in this state. As the judge swept out of the room, his robes billowing, Evelyn turned to me. The mask of the Sunday school teacher was gone. The baby-back voice was replaced by a low, toxic hiss. "You old bastard," she spat, her eyes narrowed with hatred. "You've been holding that over me this whole time? You let me come here and make a fool of myself in front of everyone." "No, Evelyn," I said, leaning over the table until I was inches from her face. "You made a fool of yourself 9 years ago. I just kept the documentation to prove it." The 15 minutes of the judicial recess did not pass like time measured by a clock. They felt like 15 grueling years spent wandering through a wasteland of silence. The courtroom air had grown stagnant, thick with the heavy scent of old, pressurized paper and the mounting realization of a total moral and legal collapse. Across the aisle, Evelyn sat perfectly still, her spine as rigid as a frozen pillar, her eyes fixed with a haunting intensity on the empty high bench of the judge. She looked like a statue carved from desperation. Marcus, however, was not possessed of the same icy composure. He was leaning in, whispering frantically into Evelyn's ear, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of rising fury and panic. Despite the distance, I could hear the jagged snippets of their desperate conversation. Words like crippling debt, impending foreclosure, and "you promised me this was a sure thing." It was the final confirmation of every suspicion my private investigator had unearthed. They had not come to this courthouse for the love of a child. They had come for a desperate, million-dollar bailout to cover their own failed gambles. Leo sat beside me, his hands folded neatly on the polished wood of the table. I could see the slight tremor in his fingers, the only sign of the earthquake happening inside him. He looked over at me, his young eyes searching mine with a vulnerability that tore through my professional armor. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. "Did she really write those things? Did she really say in her own hand that I was just a burden?" My heart ached with a physical sharpness for him. This was the exact part of the audit I'd spent 9 years trying to avoid. The devastating moment when the cold, hard numbers of reality finally break through and wound the very person they were meticulously gathered to protect. I reached over and placed my hand over his, offering the only grounding I could. "She did write them, Leo. I won't lie to you about the facts. But I want you to remember what I've told you since you were small. Some people are fundamentally incapable of seeing the true value of what they possess until they have already lost it." Her words are a ledger of her own limitations, Leo. They say everything about the vacuum in her heart, and absolutely nothing about the incredible young man sitting next to me. "All rise," the bailiff shouted, his voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. Judge Thorne returned to the bench with a stride that suggested he had seen enough. He did not look like a civil servant about to deliver a routine ruling. He looked like an executioner who had just finished sharpening the blade. He placed the heavy, wax-sealed termination papers directly on the bench in front of him and leaned forward, his piercing gaze pinning Evelyn to her chair like a specimen under glass. "In my 25 years on this bench," Thorne began, his voice low and vibrating with a controlled, righteous fury that made the very air in the room hum, "I have seen the full spectrum of human failure. I have seen parents struggle with the darkness of addiction, the crushing weight of poverty, and the blinding fog of grief. I have seen people make catastrophic, terrible mistakes in the heat of a moment. But rarely in all my decades of service have I seen such a calculated, documented, and cold-blooded display of abandonment masquerading as maternal longing." He picked up the affidavit I had submitted, the paper rustling in the silence like a dry leaf. "Mrs. Vance, you sat here today and testified under a sacred oath that you spent every resource in your possession looking for your son. You testified that Mr. Sterling stole him from you while you were supposedly incapacitated by the trauma of grief. Yet, I hold here your own handwriting, dated 9 years ago, witnessed and certified by a licensed psychologist, stating clearly and unequivocally that you were freely and voluntarily relinquishing your son in exchange for a $25,000 financial stipend and the permanent removal of all child support obligations." Evelyn's lawyer, Mr. Finch, attempted to stand, though he looked as if he wanted to dissolve into the floorboards. "Your Honor," if I may, as I mentioned previously, my client was in an incredibly fragile psychological state. Mr. Finch, sit down before you find yourself in contempt. The judge snapped, his voice hitting like a hammer. Your client was not in a state of fragility. She was in a state of pure, unadulterated greed. The financial records provided by the respondent and verified by this court show that within 48 hours of signing this document and taking that check, Mrs. Vance was seen at a high-end jewelry store in Portland, making a substantial purchase. This was not the behavior of a mother in crisis. This was a woman closing a business deal and liquidating an asset. To come into this court today, 9 years later, and claim kidnapping, to use the state police as a weapon of terror and intimidation against an elderly man and a young boy, is not just a civil matter. It is a profound mockery of this entire justice system. The judge then turned his attention directly to me, his expression softening only by the smallest of margins. Mr. Sterling, you kept this document sealed and hidden for 9 long years. The court is curious as to why you chose not to finalize this earlier. Because, Your Honor, I said, standing slowly to face him with my head held high, I am an auditor by trade and by nature. I know from decades of experience that an audit is only truly effective when all the evidence is presented at the exact moment of peak discrepancy. I wanted Leo to have a peaceful, quiet childhood, free from the shadow of this document. I wanted her to stay away because she wanted to stay away, not because she was legally barred. But I'm also a realist. I knew that the moment she realized Leo was worth more than a $25,000 check, she would come back to claim her dividend. I kept this receipt in reserve to ensure that when she finally did return, she could never, ever hurt him again. Judge Thorne nodded slowly, a look of profound respect crossing his face. You've done more than protect his finances with your meticulous records, Mr. Sterling. You've protected his life. The judge turned back to the court clerk, his voice regaining its steel. The court finds no merit in the petitioner's claims. I am denying the petitioner's request in its entirety. Furthermore, I am formally entering the voluntary termination of parental rights into the permanent state record, effective immediately. Evelyn Vance, you have no legal, civil, or biological claim to Leo Sterling. In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of this court, you are a complete stranger to him. Evelyn let out a sharp, guttural sound, a horrific noise that was half sob and half scream, collapsing forward onto the table. But the judge was far from finished. Because of the blatant, documented perjury committed in this room today and the fraudulent nature of the kidnapping report filed with the state police, I am formally referring this case to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation. And as for the matter of the trust fund, Thorne paused, his gaze shifting to Marcus, who looked as if he were trying to physically merge with the upholstery of his chair. I am placing a permanent, non-expiring restraining order on both Evelyn and Marcus Vance. You are to have absolutely no contact, direct or indirect, with Leo Sterling or Arthur Sterling. You are to stay 500 yards away from their residence, the boys' school, and any future place of his employment. If you so much as send a single text message or a letter, you will find yourselves in county jail before the sun sets. Whack! The gavel fell with the finality of a closing door. We're done here, the judge said, standing and sweeping out of the room in a blur of black silk before Evelyn could even gather the breath to protest. The courtroom immediately became a whirlwind of chaotic activity. Mr. Finch began shoving papers into his bag with frantic energy, refusing to even make eye contact with the woman who had just ruined his professional standing. Marcus stood up without a word and started walking toward the exit, ignoring Evelyn entirely. "Marcus!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high walls. "Marcus, wait. We can appeal. We can find another way to get the money." Marcus turned around at the door, his face a vibrant, pulsing red with fury. "Another way? You told me this was a slam dunk. You told me the old man was a soft touch, and he'd pay out millions just to keep you quiet. Now I've got a massive lawyer bill I can't pay, a criminal referral, and a restraining order on my permanent record. I'm done with you, Evelyn. I'm done with this baggage you brought into my life." He stormed out, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him. Evelyn was left standing alone in the center of the room. She looked small suddenly. For the first time, she didn't look like a predator. She looked like a bad investment that had finally reached a value of zero. She turned her head to look at us, her eyes hard and filled with a bitter, toxic hatred that chilled the room. She began to walk toward our table, her jaw set, but the bailiff moved with practiced efficiency, stepping into her path and resting his hand firmly on his belt. "You heard the judge, ma'am," the bailiff said, his voice flat and unyielding. 500 yards starts this second. Move along." She looked past the officer, her eyes locking onto Leo. "You think he loves you?" she hissed at her son, the mask of motherhood completely shattered. "He just wants to control you, just like his son did. He's a cold old man, and you'll see eventually. You'll see what he really is." Leo didn't flinch this time. He didn't look away or hide behind my shoulder. He stood up slowly, walked to the very edge of the table, and looked his biological mother directly in the eye. "My grandpa is the only person who stayed when things got hard," he said, his voice surprisingly deep and steady. "You didn't even stay for a single weekend. I don't want your presence, I don't want your explanations, and I certainly don't want your apologies. I just want you to leave us alone forever." Evelyn opened her mouth as if to hurl one last insult, but no words came out. The bailiff took her arm with a firm grip and guided her toward the side exit. She walked out of the courtroom, out of our lives, and into the cold, gray Washington rain. I felt a massive, invisible weight lift off my shoulders, a burden I'd been carrying in secret since that sleety night in 2015. I looked over at Diane, who was smiling broadly as she tucked her legal pads into her briefcase. "Well, Arthur," she said, her voice warm, "I've seen a lot of trials, but that was the most thorough, high-stakes audit I've ever seen performed in a court of law. You didn't leave her a single cent of credibility." "I told you, Diane," I said, shaking her hand firmly. "Documentation is the only thing that survives the storm. Feelings change, but a signature is permanent." I turned to Leo. He was still staring at the door where Evelyn had disappeared. For a moment, a flash of worry hit me. I feared he was grieving, that the finality of the rejection was too much for a 14-year-old to process in one afternoon. "Are you okay, Leo?" I asked softly, stepping closer. He looked up at me, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips, the first real smile I'd seen in days. "I'm fine, Grandpa. Actually, I think I'm better than fine. It's like the air is easier to breathe. Can we go get those pancakes now? The ones at the diner that they make in the shape of the hexagonal molecules." I laughed, a deep, rattling sound that felt like it was clearing out 9 long years of cobwebs from my lungs. "Absolutely, Leo. As many as you can possibly eat. The bill is on me." As we walked out of the courthouse, the crisp, biting air hit my face, but it didn't feel cold anymore. It felt refreshing. The sun was finally trying to break through the heavy clouds over the Puget Sound, casting long streaks of silver light across the water. I knew there would still be hard conversations in our future. I knew Leo would have complex questions about his father, about the dark choices his mother had made, and about the million-dollar future that was now safely waiting for him. But for the first time in a decade, I wasn't worried about having the answers. I had the records. I had the truth. And most importantly, I had my grandson. We drove in a comfortable silence to our favorite diner, the one with the cracked red vinyl booths and the best maple syrup in the county. We sat by the window, watching the white ferries cross the churning water of the Sound. Leo spent the next hour talking about his upcoming science fair project, his voice full of an excitement and a life that had been suppressed for far too long. I sat there, simply listening, and I realized in that moment that this was the true inheritance I had been protecting. It wasn't the $1,200,000 sitting securely in the bank. It wasn't the house or the patents Thomas had left behind. It was this, the quiet Tuesday mornings, the late-night chemistry homework, the slightly burnt pancakes, and the simple, undeniable fact that we were still together. Evelyn had tried to audit our lives and find a quick profit for herself at the expense of a child's soul. But she had failed to realize a fundamental law of the universe. The most valuable assets in this life aren't the ones you can trade for a $25,000 check. They are the ones you protect with every ounce of your being, for as long as you have breath in your body. As Leo laughed at a joke he was telling, I pulled a small, black notebook from my breast pocket, the one I use for my daily tallies. I turned to a fresh page and made one final, bold entry. Case officially closed. All assets secured. Peace restored to the household. I closed the book with a satisfying click and tucked it away. My long career as an auditor was finally, truly, and beautifully done. The weeks following the court date were the quietest I had known in a decade. It was a different kind of quiet, not the anxious, watchful silence of a man waiting for a predator to strike, but the deep, resonant peace of a house that had been scrubbed clean. The restraining order was a physical barrier, but the legal termination was a spiritual one. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt I could breathe without checking the horizon for storm clouds. Leo returned to his routine with a focus that surprised me. He didn't dwell on the woman who had called him a burden. Instead, he dove deeper into his studies, his music, and his friendships. It was as if the court's decision had given him permission to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. He knew who he was, and more importantly, he knew who he belonged to. I, however, found myself back in my study late at night, staring at the empty space on my shelf where the Evelyn binders used to sit. I had moved them to a high-shelf archive, out of sight but preserved. Habit, I suppose. An auditor never truly destroys the evidence, even after the case is adjudicated. One evening, about a month after the trial, I received a final phone call from the private investigator I'd kept on retainer. Thought you might want a closing report, Arthur, the investigator said. His voice was gravelly, the sound of a man who had seen too much of the world's underbelly. Evelyn and Marcus are officially history. He filed for divorce 2 weeks ago, claiming fraudulent inducement into the marriage. Apparently, he's telling anyone who will listen that she lied about her net worth to get him to sign on the dotted line. I leaned back in my chair, watching the moonlight dance on the surface of the sound. And Evelyn, she's moved into a small studio apartment near the docks in Tacoma, working a graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience store. No car. It was repossessed the day after the hearing. From what I hear, the district attorney is still looking into the perjury charges, but they might let it slide if she stays under the radar. She's broke, Arthur. Truly, mathematically broke. Thank you, Jim, I said. You can close the file. No more monitoring. I hung up the phone and felt a strange flicker of something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite triumph either. It was just the cold realization of a completed audit. Evelyn had spent 9 years trying to write off her responsibilities, thinking she could keep the profits of a new life without paying the taxes of her past. In the end, the interest had compounded until it bankrupted her. I walked down the hall to Leo's room. He was sitting at his desk, surrounded by circuit boards and copper wiring. He was building something for the regional science fair, a device that used salt water to conduct low-voltage electricity. "Grandpa, look at this," he said, his eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. "If I keep the salinity at exactly 3.5%, the current stays perfectly stable. It's all about the balance." I sat on the edge of his bed, watching his steady hands work the soldering iron. Balance is everything, Leo. In chemistry, in finance, and in life. If you put too much of one thing in without accounting for the other, the whole system collapses. He looked up at me, the light from his desk lamp reflecting in his glasses. Is that what happened to her? She lost her balance. She tried to live a life that didn't add up, Leo. She thought she could delete the parts of her story she didn't like. But life doesn't have a delete key. It only has a ledger. Everything you do, every choice you make, gets recorded eventually. Leo went back to his project, but I stayed there for a while, just watching him. I thought about the $1,200,000 sitting in that trust fund. It was a staggering amount of money for a 14-year-old, but as I sat in that room, I realized it was the least important thing I had given him. The real wealth was the 3,285 days of being present. It was the 2,190 school lunches I had packed. It was the 468 Saturday mornings we had spent at the library. It was the countless times I had simply listened to him talk about things I didn't fully understand, from Minecraft to molecular biology. In the world of auditing, we have a term called intangible assets. These are things that have immense value but no physical form. Things like brand reputation, intellectual property, or goodwill. As I looked at my grandson, I realized my life was overflowing with intangible assets. I was the wealthiest man I knew, not because of my pension or my portfolio, but because I had a boy who trusted me with his future. A few days later, I took the original wax-sealed envelope, the one the judge had returned to me, and I took it out to the fire pit in the backyard. The rain had paused, leaving the air damp and sweet with the smell of pine. I looked at Evelyn's handwriting one last time. I'm not suited for motherhood. I freely relinquish all claims. I realized then that I didn't need the paper anymore. The truth was no longer a weapon I had to keep sharpened in a safe. The truth was Leo's laughter coming from the kitchen. The truth was the way he walked with his head held high. The truth was the life we had built together, brick by brick, record by record. I tossed the envelope into the flames. I watched the wax melt and the paper curl, the words turning into black ash that rose and vanished into the Washington sky. The audit was over. The books were balanced. As I walked back into the house, Leo was standing by the refrigerator, looking at a flyer for a summer internship at the local marine biology center. Do you think I should apply, Grandpa? It's for high schoolers, but they said they might make an exception for someone with a strong enough portfolio. I think your portfolio is the strongest I've ever seen, Leo, I said, putting my arm around his shoulders. And if they have any questions about your qualifications, tell them to call me. I have the documentation to prove you can handle anything the world throws at you. He grinned and leaned into me. Thanks, Dad. The word hung in the air, soft and natural. He hadn't called me that in the courtroom, and he didn't say it often, but when he did, it felt like the final entry in a long, complicated journey toward home. We spent that evening planning his application, discussing the future not as a series of numbers or legal battles, but as a vast, open ocean of possibility. I knew that one day, I wouldn't be there to manage the ledgers for him. One day, he would have to conduct his own audits, face his own adversaries, and decide what was worth protecting. But as I looked at the young man he had become, I knew he was ready. I had taught him how to read the fine print. I had taught him that while people might fail you, integrity never does. And I had taught him that the most important thing you can ever account for is the person standing right in front of you. As the sun set over the Pacific, casting long, golden shadows across our living room, I sat in my favorite chair and closed my eyes. I felt the weight of my 72 years, but it wasn't a heavy weight. It was the solid, comfortable weight of a life well lived and a job well done. Good night, and take care of each other.